welcome this afternoon to our webinar from Languagenut, Assessment for Learning, AFL in MFL teaching. And this evening we've got Fiona Easton joining us. Fiona has recently joined us as Head of A-Level, and she will be introducing herself in the next couple of minutes. So, those of you that know me, I've been teaching a very long time, and so I won't spend too much time introducing myself because I think you already know me. There's my list of things that I've kind of done. I'm going to hand over to Fiona, who is going to talk a little bit and introduce herself to you tonight because she's going to be co-presenting with me. So over to you, Fiona.
Hi there, and obviously welcome everybody. So I've just started Languagenut, as Elaine said, as Head of A-Level, which is super exciting. So I'll be delivering another webinar next week. In terms of my background, I trained as a French and Spanish teacher, and I've taught all the way through from primary through to Key Stage 5. I write a weekly newsletter about content related to the A-Level curriculum, and recently I've been completing a master's this year with UCL, sort of focusing on comparative education and looking at things like resiliency and self-efficacy in the classroom. So yes, that ties in quite nicely with what we're going to be talking about today with AFL.
Great, thank you, Fiona, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome Fiona. Zoe is also in the background today. We've all met Zoe, our Head of Content, and we also have a couple of new colleagues that have joined us who are also ex-teachers and working alongside us now. So we're really super excited about our new content that's coming forward for A-Level. Okay, so as always, I'll quickly move on. Obviously, it's important to know that everything that we say tonight is basically our suggestions, and a lot of our ideas have been shared with lots of other teachers on Twitter and also on social media sites. Please be mindful of the policies of your own school, and obviously some of the things that we talk about tonight may not fit your institution, and again they're not things that we're saying you have to do. These are all suggestions. Okay, so as always, I like to keep everyone just up to date with what's going on, and we know that yesterday the DFE launched the latest 4 documents with regard to the new GCSE, which begins in 2024 and will be accredited in 2026, so that affects our present year 7, and obviously they have made some suggestions now which the exam boards are working alongside. Ofsted also is always something that we have in our on our radar, and again, obviously, as we don't advocate any particular type of teaching with our platform, neither does Ofsted. Obviously the MFL curriculum review, which came out last June, 12 months ago now, still talks about the high quality language learning may have the following features, not should have the following features, and some of the features that are actually in the MFL curriculum review we will be referring to tonight. That can I just, again, if you've not been to one of our webinars, just be mindful of the fact that if you do have an inspection and an inspector walks into your classroom or your school with a copy of the MFL curriculum review, then you should make sure that they are aware that it's not something you have to do, it's something that you may do. Okay, and that has caused 1 or 2 problems in the past, I know, for colleagues, having worked alongside many teachers over the years, and they still come back to me and say we should be doing this, when in actual fact it's only a suggestion. Okay, so where tonight's session fits with the MFL curriculum review is obviously to do with a previous webinar that we did in March on lesson objectives and success criteria, which was locating the learning for the learner and the teacher in the classroom, sort of allowing students to have a handle on how they're doing, becoming lots of research on self-efficacy, and also on the fact that they need to feel successful in their learning, how to make progress, and making sure that they are revisiting learning and that assessment is meaningful. And rather than it just be influenced by GCSE or A-Level, that a lot of the assessment that goes on in our classrooms is formative assessment. unfortunately, lots of our SLT and our management teams are always absolutely obsessed with results, and because they, that's what they are sort of judged against. Although not so much now with the Ofsted framework. It's very rare you'll meet an inspector who comes in and asks to see any results. But obviously, schools are keen to make sure that they get the best possible outcomes for their students. But we're tonight looking more along the formative road. Okay, so the key aspects of assessment for learning are what we're looking at tonight. And the rationale for the session really came from quite a few teachers who got in touch with me after the session on lesson objectives and success criteria to say how much they'd found it useful, but also would it be possible to look at some other areas of assessment for learning. And obviously we know that assessment for learning is very important and it's a very powerful way of improving learning and raising standards. And I'm also going to have a look tonight then at how we can use the strands of AFL and how it can be developed and applied effectively in the classroom. So when we come to look at AFL, we actually wonder what it actually is. I don't think there's a teacher on this planet that doesn't know or hasn't heard of assessment for learning. It's actually assessment for learning, not assessment of learning, because the assessment for learning is our formative assessment, and it's basically any type of assessment, which, let's face it, we do assessment at every stage of our teaching in a classroom, any assessment that guides learning at any stage within the learning process. And the assessment of learning is more the summative. So that's the type of tests and things that you would do at the end of a piece of learning, at the end of a period of learning, and would judge them probably there with a grade of some kind. Okay, so for those of us that are doing any research or are moving on to do any qualifications further than what you've already got, a little bit of background: Paul Black and Dylan William were the two professors in the UK who came up with the idea of AFL. When they sort of, in 1998, they recognised that what teachers and the learners do is complicated and that little was understood about it. And they sort of likened the classroom to a black box. And they kind of thought about anything that is input and any outputs. They didn't really know what was going on inside it. So they set out to investigate it. And what they discovered was that students who learned in a formative way achieved much better and obtained better results than other students. So that's why they called it the black box. And we know also that everything in to do with AFL permeates all of the teachers' standards. So if you are a trainee tonight or an ECT, then everything that's on here will be able to be used in your evidence portfolio. Just a couple of quotes there that I'm just going to quickly move on from, but those of you who like to do a little bit of the research and like to know a little bit more behind things. Okay, so the key principles then of our assessment for learning. The first one we've looked at, and I'm just going to skim over that because that was in a previous training session. And so I've put a link in this PowerPoint, which will be available to you straight after the session tonight if you email me. And my email address is at the end of the PowerPoint, but it's elaine@languagenut.com. You will be able to get all the resources on basically explaining and working out what you're trying to achieve. Empowering your students to take an active role in how they're progressing and what they're learning. Allowing students to learn from one another, so peer and self-assessment. Creating some opportunities which are quite informal to assess the knowledge and guide any actions that you make towards future learning. Giving constructive feedback, obviously that depends upon your own academy as well, because I know lots of academies and institutions and schools have different ways of doing feedback. Asking questions that are worth asking and giving time for learning to be consolidated and understood, which you might know as plenaries. Okay, so each one of those could, in actual fact, be a CPD on its own, as we know from the first one. But I'll just quickly whiz over this one. This was the first session that we did in March, and I've put a link in the chat. Sorry, not in the chat. I've put a link there to the webinar, and this is basically some of the screenshots from the session. We had a learning journey. We had how to share the objectives. We looked at the types of objectives that you might have. My own personal views on objectives and what I felt for me it worked in the classroom, and then all different types of objectives and how you can write them. Okay, and how can Languagenut support this? Well, if you are a primary colleague joining us tonight, you will know that all our lessons on our primary platform have a lesson plan, and this is a kind of screenshot from one of them. It gives you the learning outcomes, and it will also give you the extension support and any variations that you need to allow your students to meet the criteria. And obviously during also it will give you the content to be delivered within that lesson. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second of the 7, empowering our students to take an active role. Okay, so for this then, what we've got here is it's really important that your students are familiar with the key terminology from the success criteria that you're going to judge them against. So obviously, whether that be your own success criteria, whether it be exam board success criteria, and basically making sure that it is bite-sized chunks and age-related. So don't try and overwhelm them with everything from the specification, or try and give them the whole mark scheme, because that will just completely phase them and they'll not understand what you're trying to do with them. And obviously, it's important to know what works for them. What's their preferred way of being able to monitor what they do? They might have something that they feel works for them. And once you've got some sort of an idea of what kind of things they like to sort of use in the classroom, it might be worth taking that as a list and then maybe modelling that in the classroom with the students. And therefore, then you will then get a range of different types of ways of monitoring their progress. I call those pause points. So for example, I might use the bottom right hand side here. These are what I call my Vocab Crunch. The first one is the actual thing. So you have the French, English as one particular document, then folding it in half and then folding it in half again, and then maybe tearing it down the middle. And they really help the students to monitor what they're learning and how they can actually improve. If there are sections of stuff that they've forgotten, or if anything, they feel they just want to have a recap, they can then see how much they've improved. And some students I've had even like to put little ticks on in colours to show that they've remembered it 3 or 4 different times. They can take them home and you can actually split them half, and they could get mum or dad or carer, whoever's at home, can read the English and they can read the French, or vice versa. Another thing that I do is 3 of each. So I might say to them, right, just constantly in your head, think of 3 weather types, think of 3 negative adjectives, think of 3 types of transport, think of 3 connectives. And they quite enjoy that, because that enables them then to just keep remembering the certain things and maybe adding to it. And you'll see at the bottom here on the left hand side, this is taken from one of my students that I had a couple of years ago. We pre-populated this with the student, and the student used to like to look at the examples of connectives, and they could monitor then how much they could remember in putting it into different little pockets like that. And they built up their own sort of repertoire of exam past tenses and things, future tenses. And some students, you might have this as a blank thing and they just completely add to it as they go, and it shows that they are moving forward to showing that they themselves can see how they're progressing. I'm going to hand over to Fiona, because Fiona's going to take you over the reflective learning log. Over to you, Fiona.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we want to be encouraging learners to become independent at all levels, and the earlier we sort of introduce this habit, the easier we find it when we're getting through to sort of Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, where we really want pupils to be sort of taking their learning into their own hands. So reflective learning logs can be a really valuable tool. Students can keep them in their planners, in the back of their books, or if your school's got more of a bring your own device policy, they can be kept in programs like OneNote, so they can be kept online and you can always go back to them. And in these learning logs, students can be encouraged, I think, to make a note of any feedback they've received or marks, and they can also write their own reflections. Can be really, really helpful about areas in which they believe they've done well and areas where they think they might be able to improve. And on the side you've got a couple of examples of the kind of things that you might want to use lower down the school, where you've got sort of very, very scaffolded different topics that students can rate themselves on, whether or not they're happy with them, whether or not they're feeling a little bit confused, or whether or not they need a bit more work on them. And sort of further up the school, this can be useful for topic knowledge. So for A level, you might want to split that into certain topics, and pupils can actually populate those with facts, figures, interesting things that they've learned about it, so they can see how that knowledge is building as time goes on. Thanks, Elaine.
Yeah, and obviously the other one on the smaller side is for primary, which I've noticed when I've done something similar to primary, they like to colour these in. So they might decide to colour part of that I respond to rhyme, stories and songs, or I listen attentively, in one colour and build it up like a bit of a rainbow as they go on, in terms of how confident they've become. So how can Languagenut help this? Well, students do get individual feedback on multiple aspects of their learning. You will see here a screenshot of when a student has completed an actual activity on our platform, that they are told, they get a little card and it pops up and tells them what they've got right and what they've got wrong, and that will allow them to take a role in improving what they need to do. It also then shows them on their area how much their average score is here, so it will give them how they're getting on with the different topics. And then again, you can drill down to it even further under the assignments, where you can see each individual strand that is assessed and looked at and practiced on Languagenut. You can see how they're doing. So again, that's a good way of taking an active role in their progress and in monitoring what they're learning. Okay, our next one is looking at allowing students to learn from one another, the peer and self-assessment. If we're not careful, peer and self-assessment can become quite tokenist, and so we have to be careful how we do this. It's really vital to take time and practice the language of peer and self-assessment, because otherwise it could just be, oh, you've done really well today. Well, what actually does that mean? So one thing I've done is I've modelled how to do this with an anonymous piece of work, and I've gone through it several times, and it may well be that you have to do this over a number of times with some classes, depending upon how you feel that class is able to manage this. But certainly being able to look at the clear success criteria, and it can't be stressed enough that to have the success criteria in manageable small chunks and not to overwhelm them with a complete and utter success criteria bank of success criteria statements is really quite over the top. And so lots of teachers do this anyway. Nothing that we're saying tonight is anything new. It's just quite nice to attend a session sometimes where you think, you know, I've not done that for a long time and I can have a go at that tomorrow, because we're so overwhelmed with the day-to-day what's going on in the classroom that sometimes things like that they just pop out of our minds. So again, here we've just got 4 basic sentence starters with what you can use. If anybody's interested, I've got a bank of these. I used to have them on key rings, and I used to have them scattered around the classroom when this was popular and being assessed by Ofsted. But again, it's just there if anybody wants it, if anybody's interested. You're almost supporting your students really to develop a nose for quality from the very first lesson, because if you help them to do that, then by the time they become year 10 and 11, they're used to it, and then they move on to A level and it's water off a duck's back. Like I said before, begin with the very simple sections of the success criteria, and then also ensure that they've got access to best practice models, so some things that they can refer to be able to do to understand what they're looking for. Okay, so here we've got an example. You've got, for example, your question, you've got the answer, and then you've got here, this would be for an upper Key Stage 4 student. Here you've got the content. This is just something that we all do anyway, but again, sometimes I used to forget this. I used to think I must do one of these sometime. I'll get the students to be involved in this, and then it would come back into my psyche and I would use it for that year. So allowing also, basically, you could tell your learners you want to see how they've corrected and improved their work by using different colours. You might decide to put your students together and ask them to think of one thing that they're proud of in their work, and they have to tell their partner in 1 minute what they're proud of. For primary, I've always used a learning wall because they're quite used to having their own comments on the wall, and the students might have some post-its and they could say, oh, little Johnny has done really well. He's used one adjective in his sentence that is correct. And they like to put things up on the wall about each other in primary. You may have a secondary class that you think you could trial that with. Again, it's just a suggestion of things that I've done and have worked. Another thing I've done is spotlighting, an actual metaphorical spotlight, although I must admit I remember having a trainee teacher that we discussed with this, and she actually brought a proper spotlight in and put it over the students, which turned out to be quite fun really. They quite enjoyed it, where when the students are doing the peer assessment or they're working with another student or in a group, you actually sort of stop the lesson and you say, right, all of you just stop, we'll just let this group carry on, and they carried on with their peer assessing, and the rest of the class would listen and give them some formative feedback about they'd done done that, you would obviously have to be very confident with the students that you used for that, because some students will just clam up and not want to be involved in that. But again, at A level, it could be something which might work. Up leveling is something else, is when you are modeling your feedback to a student, is to maybe use a weak piece of work from another year group, or maybe keep one back from the year after, from the year before, or even use a made up one, and show how it can be improved, and get the students to encourage the students to give you ideas on how to do that. And the spectacles of feedback is something that I've done with primary, where we've even made our own little we've made our own glasses in art and technology, and they've decorated them, and whenever they've been doing any feedback to a student, they've put them on, and they've quite enjoyed doing that. It's just a bit of fun, really. This is a critical friends tally chart. This is from a very long time ago what I used, but it's something which I've used again and again and again, where it's just a simple tick list of how many past tenses. And again, I think when I showed you at the beginning, I showed you can actually populate that with actual examples. And one thing I do when I'm examining is I will make sure I've got one of these, a much bigger one, and I will write in each time a student says something and the different verb, because that way you are encouraging your students to use as many different verbs as possible rather than just stick to the same ones. Okay, Fiona, I'll hand over to you for this one.
Thank you. Yeah, so just looking at how Languagenut can help you in terms of the peer and self-assessment, and circling back to mark schemes, one really exciting sort of new feature that we've got coming out with the A level, and it's going to be trickled down to GCSE as well, is that when you're marking, you're going to be able to get to see a pop-up of the mark scheme that's relevant to your exam board. And when students go into their area and look at their feedback, they should also be able to open that mark scheme as well. So they are always going to be able to have that option to flip between the official mark scheme as well as the feedback that you've given for them. In addition to that, I think something that I find really, really useful with a sort of peer assessment with listening tasks is having transcripts available, and those are also going to be available, and they are available at the moment in GCSE for Languagenut, so that when students have completed a listening exercise, you might want them to then switch over their work and they can mark what they've already done using the transcript, and see if they can make any corrections, see if they can make any additional sort of responses in a different colour or something along those lines, and that can be a really useful tool for sort of doing peer assessment and self-assessment when you're doing listening exercises as well.
Perfect, thank you, Fiona. So move on to our next AFL principle, which is creating opportunities to assess them and understand and guide your future actions. Well, we all know that during every lesson, we're constantly assessing students. There is absolutely no doubt about that. We assess all the time. And some things that you could use are the KWL tables. You know, you want to learn and learned. I used to use one in languages which was I know you, I've seen you somewhere before, and I haven't got a Scooby-Doo who you are. So basically we used to use that with weaker students for populating it with vocabulary, and that used to support their monitoring of their learning as well. Also, we all do mini plenaries, and we use whiteboards. I think one of the things that I've noticed, certainly by working alongside a lot of staff that are very new to the profession, a lot of colleagues get very stressed about changing the lesson if it's not working. Well, I think you need to kind of park that, because if you know that the lesson isn't working, we all do this, we all go off at a tangent and we think it's important. Don't worry if that's something that you have to do. Because it will allow you to maybe then make sure that the learning that you're trying to teach is going to actually be properly learned. Okay, pass to you, Fiona, for the assessing and revising grammar.
Yeah, absolutely. I think grammar is one of those areas that obviously, you know, we have disagreements about whether or not to teach it explicitly or whether to sort of introduce it gradually. But one of the nice things that you can do with this on the spot opportunities with grammar is go back, revisit easier topics that you may have covered, maybe even as early as Key Stage 3, and just throw them into a lesson in a really, really quick way to give students a quick win, and to get those grammar points that come up time and time again, constantly repeated throughout the lessons.
Great stuff, thank you. And the smiley, impartial, and the grumpy there are obviously for students to be able to say what they can do and not do, and what they are feeling comfortable with if you are teaching secondary, or even mostly for primary. Okay, so this was a screen grab that I did from a previous training session, and rather type it all out, I put it in here. So basically, how you can assess the knowledge is at the end of your lesson, get into the habit of getting your students to do one of the following. So make a bingo card, which you can use as a starter in the next lesson. Make a noughts and crosses game, which they can play as a starter in the next lesson. Draw what you've learned in the lesson today, and then you can swap that in the next lesson with your partner, and they have to describe the picture orally or written. You can do a mind map. You could write a short paragraph, or you could design an exercise to test your understanding, your peers' understanding of the main points in the next lesson. And again, that will be available for you to see in much more detail. So I'm going to skip over on to the next one. Here we've got obviously how Languagenut can help. So you can find the gaps in the learning to inform your future planning, because again, as we've said, each activity will give you this little pop-up card and will allow you to see as a teacher and as a student where the gaps are in your learning. And there's lots of low stakes quizzing, so you can practice as many times on our site before you take the quiz, and you can even do the quiz lots of different times. It locks you out after 5 goes in one day, but you can actually, I think that's right, but you can go and do the quiz on the next day if you felt that you wanted to. And as Fiona mentioned about the grammar, I'll pop back to Fiona on this one, because I know Fiona wanted to say something about this grammar with being the A-level product. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's just a quick screen grab from our grammar section from our A-level product. And as you can see, as well as having populated it with new sort of higher level topics for A-level, we've also within that product got the access to the advanced level and the beginner grammar. So as I said, circling back to the point about doing quick win grammar activities, you know, even with sort of key stage 5 classes or higher classes, you can go back into beginner grammar and do a quick fire activity with that.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, so let's now look at giving constructive feedback. Constructive feedback was a professor called John Hattie from New Zealand, who's a professor of education, said that feedback was the most powerful single moderator that enhances achievement. And so giving constructive feedback, obviously this is one of the things that you have to be mindful of with your own institution. Some institutions have their own feedback policy. I've tried to shy away from using marking for many years and use the word feedback, and tried to comment just with comments rather than grades. I know it's really difficult because students, we're just as humans, we want to know how we've done. But one of the things that if you can do this with your students, it's really, really positive when it comes out, because they will really understand the importance of the feedback. We all know we spend hours with piles of books and we go back, and it's so awful when you get into the classroom, and it's soul destroying when they just look at the comment, look at the grade, they don't even read the comment. So it's kind of like getting that fine balance really between teacher workload. One thing that I sometimes do here, you would have this is obviously from a past paper, you've got the question, the response, and then obviously looking at the mark scheme here. Again, you may well add the mark scheme what the student got, and you could actually use that then as an extra bit if that's what you wanted to do. I've always been really careful when I've been doing feedback, because the language of feedback can really damage motivation. So I try and avoid the word things like but, and I use and I find that students are much more that they will engage more with feedback if the language for that is correct. So we all know that effective feedback then is feedback which causes thinking to take place, and feedback is not necessarily written, often it's verbal. And obviously having time to invest in that is so important. Giving up lesson time, it can eat into our lesson time, and we really get stressed about how much we've got to cover with the content of the courses that we deliver. But as we know, if you teach your scheme of work, if you can build in some reflection time, some feedback lessons, some buffer lessons, and integrate them into your schemes of work, you will find that it will give you a much more opportunity to have these meaningful conversations with your students. There are lots of different ways in which you can give feedback, and I've put some on here, so you know, I apologize if you already use those or you think, well, I'd never use that. The praise action response, obviously praising your students. You could praise them for their work ethic, for their sticking at it when they couldn't do it, for their attitude, you know, for the fact that they've supported somebody else or they've managed to do part of it without their notes. Give them an action to do and then respond. You may well find that that is something which can allow the students then to be more formative, because it will then see, you will then see from the marking, from the feedback, how you can then plan your next lesson. You may well use it as a starter activity. You moving forward in 5, how much better can you improve your work? Because it does give students confidence, and that they can achieve if you use the right language and give them the praise for the effort and the attitude that they have towards their feedback and reading it and actually acting on it. Making sure that it's kind, helpful and specific. And those of you I've dropped in Austin's butterfly there, if anybody wanted to do a bit of research, that really hones you in on how to specifically give feedback to students. Feeding back and feeding forward, so that they know, you know, what have they done? Are they clear about what they've done wrong or what's missing? And pick on one specific feedback point on that particular piece of work. It's always interesting when I've done training and looked on book looks with staff in schools, which I've done many over the years. Staff try and put the feedback in, and it's a case of where do you put it? Well, I've tried all sorts of different things, and feedback margins, you might get the students to leave a bigger margin, or you might get them to do. One thing I've done is to leave the left-hand side page blank and write on the right-hand side. And as a result of that, I've been able to make the corrections to anything or add any comments in on the left-hand side, which has then not disturbed the marks, the layout of the students' work. Particularly with the older students, I get them to write on every other line, because that then it doesn't mess up their work then if you have to make some corrections, and it doesn't make it difficult for them to follow. Maybe keep it simple and just say to them, we'll change 4 of your adjectives in this piece of work. You don't have to change anything else, just see if you can improve your adjectives. And if you are doing feedback, it's interesting, if you're doing a lesson on it or 2, how do you set out the room? And if you can set out the room in a different way, I've always found that having it as a horseshoe where the kids have been sat on the inside, and I've been able to get around and do the feedback quite easily then without having to weave in and out of the desk. I appreciate that that's probably not going to be possible for many of us because of the fact that we move class. You may not have your own classroom, or also, you know, it's a big ask to do that in the middle of the day, but it's just there as an option. Delayed gratification is something that I've done where I've actually got the students to look at their work during the lesson. We've gone through some common mistakes and common errors, and then I've given them their own feedback at the end in an envelope, just a little bit different, so that they go out of the room or they have the last 5 minutes to read the comments, and they quite like doing that. It's almost like getting your exam results on the day. And then one other thing I do is the 4x4. So we've explored and taken an exemplar response from a previous year or from somebody else, another class maybe, or if you're in a trust you can swap work and things like that, so it makes it even more anonymous. We've explored the actual piece of work on a visualizer. We've worked out what kind of feedback we would give, then we've modelled how we would improve it. I've modelled that, and then I've let the class go with their own piece of work to improve it. Okay, so Fiona, I'll hand over to you on this one.
Yeah, brilliant. So obviously in terms of using Languagenut for giving your feedback, in Languagenut, once students have completed a speaking or writing activity, as a teacher, you can obviously go into their assignment and provide either written or audio feedback. So both of those options are available to you. And then once your feedback is in and it's been added, students then will be alerted to this, and they will then be able to go and review that feedback, and they'll always be able to go back and revisit this. It won't get deleted. One thing that I'm particularly excited about, and it's quite a small screenshot at the bottom of the page there, is that in our new A-level product, and hopefully this is going to come down to GCSE as well, what we've also got enabled is the ability to highlight particular parts of a student's answer, and you will then get a comment box which will appear, and so you can comment on specific parts of that work, and then when students see that work, they'll see the bits that have been highlighted, and if they put their cursor over those, they'll be able to see the specific comment that you've made for each one. So that can be a really nice way, alongside your sort of overall comments, to really hone in on sort of particular parts, particularly in a writing activity or a translation, of what went well and what could potentially go better. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you, Fiona. And as Fiona says, that's a really exciting development for our product. Okay, so a couple more. Asking questions worth asking is really something we all ask questions. We ask far many more questions than student answer. In fact, I was looking at some research only yesterday, actually. It said, 60% of students go through school and they never talk to a teacher or answer a question. I find that incredible, but apparently that's what the latest stats are telling us. So it's interesting to ask the students what questions they're interested in knowing. And going forward with the new GCSE, that's going to possibly be an interesting development there, where we're suddenly seeing that maybe the topics are not going to be as rigorous as what we've been used to. You could say to a student, well, what might a possible answer be? That way you're not putting a student on the spot to say this is right or wrong. What might we actually answer? It's less threatening for a student. Here we've got an example, and I've seen this quite a few times in classes. Did you go out last night? And when I examine students, which I've done for many years now, you will often hear teachers say, did you go out last night, in the target language, and the student will go, yes. Well, actually, where do you go with that? Where did you go? It's a little bit more kind of giving them a bit more of an open question. What did you do after school yesterday? The student still might say I went out, but at least it's a sentence rather than a yes or a no. Where do you stand when you're asking questions? Do you walk around? It's quite disorientating if you ever try it, making a student sit there in front of you and you're walking around at the back of the student or in front of the student and they're looking at you all over the shop. It's really interesting to monitor your own position when you're asking questions. Standing still is the most effective way of asking questions. The question bracelets are something that I've used quite a lot, and you'll see here these are like concert bands that you can buy cheaply off eBay, and basically I will give a student each one and they might have a question on it, and it just helps them to remember questions and all sorts of things there. Or you might distribute slips of paper at the beginning of a lesson, and as a child answers the question, they hand over the piece of paper so that you can see who's actually answered a question, and it just makes it a little bit clearer for you then. Other ways of doing questions is putting the question on the board, makes it easier. You can reveal it slowly or whatever. One thing I do is wait time, and I'll say in my head 1, 2, 3, 4, got to wait a little more, because that we're all guilty of jumping straight in. Putting the position of the name of the student. So if I said to you, Paul, what time is it? And then Paul will just look and he knows he has to answer, and the rest of the class switch off. What time is it? Pause, Paul. And that way all the kids think it might be me that gets this question. We all know hands down. We all know think, pair, share. And think, pair, square, share is maybe you think it yourself, you share it with a partner, you share it with a four, and then you share the answer. You could place a minimum number of words to be used in the answer, or you could give the students the opportunity to articulate their thinking, because if you hear a student say the word, so 30 seconds in silent thinking, then they discuss it with their partner and they rehearse it for 2 to 3 minutes or a few seconds or whatever, and then they double up maybe, and then you ask someone to give the answer. That does work quite well. Okay, and then role play questions, Fiona?
Oh yes, this is just something that I quite enjoy using with the older year groups, particularly A level, where I'll ask quite an open question, ideally something that might be a bit polemic, and I will pre-assign roles to the different students who are going to be involved in that conversation, and so they're forced then to answer the question as if they were that person, if they were the role that they've been given, which is quite a good way of getting them to think, okay, not just my opinion, but what my other opinions be about this topic, which is a nice way of getting them into thinking about writing essays or thinking about the speaking exam as well.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. And I'm sure the posing pausing, bouncing and pouncing and bouncing is something. So you're bouncing the answers around the room. Jimmy, what do you think of Sandra's answer? How could you develop it? And then how might you combine all we've heard into a single answer? And then you might then get a student who you think hasn't been listening, or someone who might benefit from being able to repeat the answer again. Can you just tell me that answer again? What did so-and-so say? What did that say? So you're actually repeating and practicing the actual target language by just getting the same answer said, but over a number of 2 or 3 students. Okay, just support a lot there to listen to it a few times. And then obviously, you know, you might have an incorrect discussion. You might use a wobble, what a bad one looks like. So rather than thinking, well, this is not that great, we might say, well, you know, what misconceptions have we got here? Can we look at this, and how can we actually improve it? And it leads to improving on that misconceived reasoning and gives that atmosphere that it's okay to be wrong, which sometimes students get stressed about. That's why I always think whiteboards are great in class, because boys love to write. They don't like to do anything wrong, so they can just literally get rid of the answer there and then. Okay. And then this one is how Languagenut can help you. You can set your own questions in the speaking and writing exam skills area. We have custom content there, and here you can see a screenshot from that. And also you can upload your own pictures alongside the ones that we already have on our site for you to use. And then our last principle is giving time for learning to be consolidated and understood. And this, again, as we've said, is to build in your consolidation and your buffer weeks. Don't pack out your curriculum so that it's so full that you just think, oh my word, what's going to happen if I miss this week, if I miss that week? Because we all know that less is more. It's better to teach quality rather than quantity. And over the 5 years that you're going to be delivering the curriculum, you will, I am sure, manage to deliver what you need to deliver. We all know about plenaries. Plenary Triangles is something that's been kicking about for many years, where at the end of the lesson, the students write down 3 things that they've learned. They might create a visual of today's learning. They might have some sentence stems which you provide them with to be able to consolidate and say what they've understood. Ask them one thing that they've learned today. That allows that to be consolidated. Post-its were in fashion at one bit. Again, you might find those useful. If you do projects or you do performances, again, one of the things that I was often used to do was I would get students to wear glasses or wear rings around their necks or some flowers or something like that, and they would be going around asking questions, and so the glasses might be the people asking the questions, and the hats or the garlands would be the ones who would be giving the answers, and then they would swap over. And it's quite fun to do that, and they could just take notes as they're going round as to what they've picked up and remembered, or what's something that they need to think, I need to pick that up and remember it for next lesson or for next topic. Obviously before COVID, that was something I did a lot of, and then obviously along came that the lockdown and everything, that became much less available to us now, but again, it's starting to become much easier for us to do things like that. Retrieval starter quizzes, again, you might just, as I've mentioned earlier, you could get the students to do something at the end of a lesson and then use it as a retrieval starter at the beginning. And then I'll pass over to Fiona to look at the summative assessment and the model answers.
Yeah, just to round off this part, obviously most of this presentation has been about informal or formative assessment. Obviously we all do every now and then have to do summative assessments, end of module tests or end of year tests. And in terms of consolidating learning, I just think it's important to sort of remind here that we can use summative assessments in a formative way. Once students have done an assessment and they've got their results back, it is really valuable to be able to take some time to properly go through it and make sure that they're able to go away knowing what the correct answers were, knowing how they could have improved their answers, and that's where model answers come in. So making sure they have access to that mark scheme, or have access to, if it was a writing task, you know, a really good version of an answer to that task, so they can go away and it's not just like they've been given a grade and that's it, but they are also able to sort of build on it and use it as a proper learning opportunity.
Great, thank you, Fiona. And to our last but one slide, which is how Languagenut can help you. Obviously, you can revisit core knowledge at any time. Your students can do that on their own, or they can do it guided by yourself on any device. it allows you to regularly revisit what you teach. One of the things I used to do was I would say, right, week 1, this is your vocabulary. They didn't know what was in that vocabulary, but it would be some revisiting. And then by the time we get to week 7, I might be using stuff from weeks 2, weeks 4, weeks 5, just to keep them ongoing. So they didn't have a clue what was in that particular vocab. You can use our admin area to see, again, this is a couple of times you've seen this tonight where the gaps are, but that allows you to consolidate and understand, allows them to consolidate and keep going over the stuff that they're getting wrong. And obviously over to you, Fiona, for the very last bullet point on this session.
Oh yes, absolutely. So that's, again, sort of, this ties into a lot of the things we've said tonight, but obviously within Languagenut, students have access to practice as many times as they want to before they take a quiz or before they complete something that you're going to mark. And that is something that in your admin section, when you set an assignment, you can enforce practice. So for those learners that you know do need or do have a tendency to rush through things, you can make sure that they practice the activities before they sort of submit their responses finally.
Thank you. And to our very last slide, which again gives us our details, and fiona@languagenut.com is Fiona's email, which we have there. If you are interested in having a free demo and a trial of Languagenut, please get in touch with us. If you're interested in finding out more about the A-level product, which, as you know, there's going to be a session next week, which Fiona's going to be doing alongside Zoe, our head of content, then please get in touch with us and sign up for that. We've got over 180 people, I think, have already signed up for that. Again, that is something which you may be interested in if you teach A-level, AS or whatever, or if you teach Highers in Scotland, or you teach the I international A-level if you are in another part of the world. So I will now find out if we have any questions in the chat. It is 16:49. I think this is incredibly good that we finished 11 minutes early. We don't normally finish this early. So I will ask Zoe if she has any questions for us that have appeared in the chat.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Well, thank you to both of you for a brilliant webinar. It's been really interesting, and we've got a couple of questions through. While you're answering those, if anybody else has any other questions, there's just probably enough time if you want to pop them in the Q&A and send them to me, and I will pose them afterwards. But to start with, this is to either of you. This is a message from Joe, who said, referring to when you were talking about verbal feedback. And they've said that they really like this idea, but they're under so much pressure from the SLT to have feedback in the books. So then the only way to get around it is a kind of one of those stamps. I remember I used those myself, verbal feedback given, which kind of seems like a bit of a pointless posturing sort of thing. Do you have any tips on how can you give verbal feedback to reduce your workload, but at the same time, you know, satisfy the demands of SLT who maybe might not understand?
I think, Fiona, do you want to take that or shall I?
No, you go for it, Elaine, if you're happy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you'll be able to add some things. There's lots of apps out there if you look, and you're going to ask me for an app now, aren't you? But I know there are, and if you want to find one out, I can find it for you that you can use. One of the things I've always done, because you will always get, why is there not a lot of work in your books, and why is this not happening? I always get the students to put verbal feedback given, as Zoe said there, or even to in the plenary is just to say, right, I want you to summarise in one sentence what I said to you today. So there used to be a time when the lesson objectives had to be written in there and you had to write something in there, and sometimes all my students used to do was lesson objective and then Miss said this and this about me, or can I improve this? And when they did the books scrutinies, they used to go, don't you ever do any written work? And I said, yeah, we do lots of written work, but if they can say it, they can write it. So it's a case of making sure that you've got that evidence in there. Again, I know it's difficult and I know you're probably not going to be happy with that answer, but that's what I always found would shut them up. And also another thing to do is a student voice. So if you do a student voice once every term, or maybe even once in the year, and just get the students to very pertinently ask those questions. how much feedback do you get? What kind of feedback do you get? And then actually shove that under the nose of your SLT and say, this is our results from our SLT, from our departmental feedback. This is what we do. I've got lots of questions for student voice. If you want those, just email me. I can send you those. And also the other thing was, obviously, if you use Languagenut, you've got the opportunity there to give the verbal feedback. And that allows you to have that stored on the one side. And if you want your SLT member to, or line manager, to see that, say, here's a login, because you can give them the logins, because all stakeholders can have a login on Languagenut to see how the students are doing. Have a listen in and see put the onus back on them, and just let them, if they're that interested, they'll go and listen. And I bet you they won't.
Brilliant, thanks for that. I think I agree. The verbal feedback is such, it can be such a powerful tool. It doesn't always work with the regulations or the frameworks that you might have, but that's great. I have a question from Layla, who is saying about referring to when you were talking about self-assessment and peer assessment, which she really likes, but she says that just does not work with any unmotivated learners. So she's got some difficult classes and they just write silly things or don't do it or just write I'm rubbish or whatever. So do you have any tips for, can you do that, or is it actually just worth dropping and only doing teacher assessment?
If you don't mind, I'll take that one, Elaine. I think, you know, having worked in schools with various sort of behaviour, challenges, I would say that if you do have a class where you do have a few learners like that, I guess, you know, you probably don't throw them in at the deep end. Finding ways to do the peer assessment in a way that makes it fun. So if you can, in any way you can gamify it. So if it's a piece of writing, make it super simple to begin with what they're trying to do. So, you know, maybe even they just have to find a couple of adjectives and sort of attach some kind of point system to it, so that, you know, there's motivation, there's reward for that. And hopefully in that way you can sort of build the trust, and as time goes on you can make those activities a bit more complex and a bit more sort of worthwhile as well.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that as well, Fiona, I've been taught in inner city Leeds for 18 years myself. I had kids, you know, that would chuck chairs at you rather than look at you. And so that kind of thing. What I did was I used one sentence stem, and that was it for the whole year. So it would have been a very simple one, like, you know, my partner's work has been great because, and they had to give some sort of unusual things, and I would build up a bank of adjectives with them, which helped with their literacy skills. It was never in the target language, it was always in English. And that way we managed to get that. And as Fiona said, if you can give some sort of rewards for the most interesting ones, and I use the spotlighting for that as well, because the students who, you know, they're probably going to come out with some really disgusting words that you don't want to hear. So it may not be a good idea to use that until you've got to a stage where you know you can trust maybe one or two groups, one or two couples in that group. But realistically, if you feel it's not going to work, then don't do it, because you don't want to give yourself more problems than you possibly have already got.
Great, thanks very much. And if I can just add in as well, from my experience, I found that the more sort of closed and quantitative you can make it, so really following a kind of, you know, there's a mark sheet, a tick sheet or something, they've got to listen to their partner and tick the number of times they say certain words, like almost like a bingo, anything like that, where it's really, really structured. I find that far more successful than a kind of open, qualitative, looking for, you know, the 3 stars to wish. I find that that doesn't necessarily work as well. Great, and last question is from Louise, asking about actually a question about Languagenut. So whether it's possible to set homework tasks on Languagenut and share the link via another platform. I don't believe that is currently possible at the moment, unless anyone can correct me. But that's really helpful to know. That's something that might be interesting to you. I'm guessing you're sort of thinking, you know, Google Classroom, that kind of thing. So yeah, any ideas like that, great, send them our way, and we will definitely do our best to get those integrated if at all possible. Okay, that's all the questions I have.
Great.
Everybody, thank you so much to Fiona and Elaine.
Yeah.
And if I could just say as well, any feedback that you have, we'd love to hear it. If you could let us know if you found the session helpful or not, and any further sessions you'd like to see, and if you would like to share with your colleagues if you found it useful, because we want to get these CPD sessions you know, as far and wide as we can, so that people can share in the expertise that we have of all the ex-teachers that work with Languagenut.
Yeah, and if you have enjoyed it tonight, or you found anything useful, please share it on social media as well, because obviously the more people we can get to see our webinars, the better. And obviously, you know, because we do have a moral purpose as well as a material existence, and it's always great when people say that they've enjoyed the sessions that we run and they've found them useful.
Brilliant, thank you. And Elaine, if you could just flash up very quickly that slide with all the upcoming webinars, in case, just a little reminder,
will.
in case anyone's interested in some other ones we've got coming up.
Yeah, I'll just
we've got
wait.
A level next week. If you're in a school, if you don't teach A level but you're in a school where people do teach A level, do pass it on that we've got that going on next week. That would be great to see as many people as possible.
Yeah, definitely. Even if you are, you know, it's French and Spanish that we're doing at the moment, but obviously German will be coming. But even if you are considering possibly doing it A level, it might be something which would be, you know, if you've got an opportunity to look at the product and see what we're doing, as well as lots of other ideas that I know Fiona and Zoe are going to talk about on the session. That's
absolutely right. So it's not a sales pitch for Languagenut. It is actually also a full CPD session. We're showing you what we've got, but yeah, also Fiona in particular is a very, very experienced A-level teacher. So I've got some really interesting tips for everyone. Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the feedback and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.